Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to get great sounding cinematic percussion. We're going to talk about mixing cinematic percussion, we're going to talk about MIDI programming tips, and much more. Let's get started. To begin with, for these examples, I'm going to be using Scoring Percussion, which is an expansion for Groove Agent and Groove Agent SE. It's really big, it's really cinematic. So what I'm doing here is I've created a cinematic percussion arrangement. I'm using the patterns that are included in the Scoring Percussion expansion, and we're going to start working on these sounds. Now, the first tip I want to give you when it comes to getting a great cinematic percussion sound is to treat it like a drum kit. And when I'm saying like a drum kit, I mean most of the times cinematic percussion libraries come with a lot of content, and this can be grand casas, it can be big hits, it can be snares, it can be percussion, it can be metal percussion, it can be different effects. And the best way to start treating all these elements is by sending them to separate channels. Now, when it comes to Scoring Percussion and Groove Agent, this is very easy to do. Let me give you a quick example. I have this part right here, and it sounds like this. Now, as you can hear, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. So if I start treating this as a loop, then I'm going to run into problems. I'm not going to have too much flexibility. But what I can do is I can go to my mixer page right here. And as you can see, we have all the elements. So we have kicks, snares, toms, timpanis, we have congas, bongos, cymbals, grand casa, snares, tambourines, hits, percussion loops, loop metals, and a hi-hat, and all these elements are being used. So the best way to get started mixing cinematic percussion is by sending all these elements to separate buses. And that's what I've done here. I have my kick going to output number 2, my snare going to output number 3, and so on and so forth. Now, the great thing with Groove Agent is that once you send all these elements to different outputs, then these outputs will appear in the Cubase mixer with the right names as well. So you don't really have to sweat when you want to start mixing your cinematic percussion. Now, once you do this, you have total flexibility when you want to mix all those elements together. For example, in this case, as you can see, I have my kick drum here, and you will see that I have a filter here. I have a frequency EQ that boosts the low end a little bit. For my snare, for example, I'm filtering a little bit more of the low end because I don't want the rumble to get in the way of my kick drum. And you can see for the grand casa, for example, I have filtered out the top end because I want to leave the top end so that my rhythmic elements like my metals, my hi-hats can breathe a little bit and they have more space to expand. And it means that you can also send your different channels to reverbs, to effects, and all these things. You can also pan your elements, you can do volume automation, so it's very, very important that you separate your elements before you start mixing your orchestral percussion. Now, the next tip I want to talk about is all about dynamics processing, and more specifically, the use of envelope shapers when you're crafting your cinematic percussion sound. Now, of course, your instinct might be to immediately go to a compressor and start compressing your cinematic percussion. Now, this is all very valid and it absolutely works, but sometimes you might want to have a little bit more control over your dynamics when it comes to cinematic percussion. And this is because compared to conventional drums, cinematic percussion tends to have a lot of low end. It has a wide frequency spectrum. So if you check these percussion loops here, you see they occupy a lot of frequencies, right? It's low end, it's mid-range, it's top end. So a conventional compressor might not give you the desired results because it's very easy for a compressor to start squeezing the life out of cinematic percussion. Sometimes you might want your dynamics to be exaggerated actually instead of being compressed. But I'm going to show you how envelope shapers can help you get a more even sound, a more sustained sound without overcompressing your cinematic percussion, because contrast and impact is paramount to orchestral music. So let me show you how I would approach a very busy part like this one. So I'm going to start with the kick drum, and I'm going to solo the kick drum, and let's see what we can do. So I'm going to go to my channel strip in Cubase, and I'm going to activate my envelope shaper. And as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm enhancing the attack of the kick drum, but I'm also making it a little bit tighter with the release. Why? Because I don't need this kick drum to be very long and for this low end to be rumbling on throughout the piece, because I have many other elements that fight for this low end, like the hits, like the percussion loops, all these things. So I'm trying to make this tighter actually. If I run this through a compressor, what I would do would be probably to enhance the attack a little bit, but then the release would be longer, it would be pronounced, and I don't want this. Instead, I want to take full control of the dynamics of the envelope of this kick drum. Let's have a listen. See that? Tight. Without it? So I made this release a little bit tighter. Let's move on to another channel. Let's move on to the congas. Now in this case, I want to make the release a little bit longer. And this is because I want these congas to ring out. Sometimes a problem that you will experience with cinematic percussion is that in the context of a mix, they tend to sound small. This is because we have really loud transients and not so loud body for the sound. And I'm going to show you another trick later on how we can make the sound bigger in this regard. So now that we've added our envelope shapers on the channels that we want to, let's listen with and without all the envelope shapers, and let's see how we transformed this mix of cinematic percussion. So as you can hear, the sound is bigger, it doesn't sound compressed, but still we managed to get some sustain out of our cinematic percussion. We managed to get excitement without making the sound dull or shaving off the transients. I'm only shaving off the transients where I need to shave off the transients. So before you reach out for a compressor, try an envelope shaper plugin. It will really make a big difference to your cinematic percussion. Now the next tip that I want to talk about is all about MIDI arrangement, MIDI programming, right? So as you can see, I am going to open this loop right here, and this is one of the included loops from Scoring Percussion. And as you can see, the elements are not perfectly timed. They're not quantized to death. And this is a very, very energetic loop. But as you can see, nothing is perfectly on the grid. And this is the tip. I would suggest that you never try and quantize cinematic drums perfectly, because if all the elements play at the same exact spot, then the sound is going to be smaller. It sounds weird, but this is the case. You always want to have a little bit of room between the elements so that they can ring out better, that your transients don't clash with each other. It's very, very important. And I would also suggest that if you can, when you're programming drums, try and play them on a keyboard, on a pad controller. This will give you a much better feel, a much better sound in the end. Even if you can't play perfectly in time, it's better to try and correct them later on rather than entering the notes with a mouse and then trying to make them sound more natural. So I would always suggest against quantizing 100% with cinematic percussion. And speaking about MIDI programming, one of the other reasons why I'm saying that it's a great idea to program your cinematic percussion by playing them on a keyboard or on a pad controller is because you're taking control of your dynamics. Because it's very important to understand that all these elements, they shine when it comes to dynamics. And this is mainly velocity for cinematic percussion. So one tip that I want to give you is that the highest velocities don't necessarily give you the bigger sound. And I want to demonstrate this by using this example. I have this sample here, right? So it's a nice hit, but listen to how it sounds when I play a lower velocity, okay? Compared to this. Now, you will be able to tell that when I play lower velocities, the sound spreads. It's a bigger sound, it has more low end. This is really cool as well. And the louder I play, I get more attack, a little bit more of the mallet, but in general, the sound suffers in the low end when you play really loud. And this happens on real instruments as well. When you play softly, the membrane vibrates in lower frequencies, so you get more low end. This has lots of top end, lots of mid-range. It has low end, of course, but if you really want to get a big low end, just try lower velocities. You might need to boost a little bit with your volume, but the sound will be much, much bigger. Sometimes you might want the impact, so that's fine. But don't forget your velocities, don't forget your dynamics. The next tip I want to talk about is using your reverbs wisely, using your reverbs to add depth, to add a 3D sound to your cinematic percussion. And reverbs are really self-explanatory, but it pays off if you don't just use your reverbs as a plain reverb, just to add a sound over space in your orchestral percussion. Reverbs can be used cleverly to add a little bit of a 3D quality to your cinematic percussion. And here's what I'm doing here. I have two reverbs. I have a short reverb right here, which is a small hole from Reverbs, and a long reverb here, which is a large VNS hole, again from Reverbs. These are convolution reverbs, but of course, any type of reverb will work in this scenario. So what I'm doing here is I'm picking and choosing the right reverb for each element. For example, as you can see, for the hi-hats, I have a long reverb right there. But for the loop metals, I have both the long and short reverb. In this case, I'm going to play the percussion loops and I'm going to show you how each reverb sounds like, okay? So let's try the short reverb first. Now the long reverb. Now you can hear that the short reverb doesn't give you this impression like an obvious reverb going on, but it makes the sound a little bit more open. It gives you a little bit of depth, a little bit of width to these percussion loops. And the long reverb does sound a little bit more like a reverb, and it actually contributes to giving these loops a little bit of body because they sustain a little bit longer. Now let's try and blend these two reverbs and see what we can get out of these. So as you can hear, we made the sound a little bit more 3D. We made our drums sound bigger, but they don't sound like they're washed in reverb because I'm favoring the short reverb compared to the long reverb in this case. I'm adding just a bit of long reverb to the point that I can't really hear it and I can't really discern that this is a reverb that I added. And you have to be very careful with the reverb times. A really long reverb can make your sound really mushy, and you don't want this when it comes to cinematic percussion, except if you have a very, very slow passage and you want the reverb to just ring out. Another very cool trick as a bonus, it's very, very effective if you automate your reverbs, and maybe you want to bring them in when there's a moment that you want to accentuate. It's a very cool trick to just ride those faders and add some contrast to your mixes. And now let's move on to the last tip for today, and this is using parallel compression and bus processing. And I'm going to show you what I tend to use when I'm mixing cinematic percussion. I'm going to give you some examples on what I use on my cinematic percussion bus. But before we get there, let me explain parallel compression, because parallel compression works great with cinematic percussion. So what I've done here is I have sent all my elements to a bus. So basically all my percussion, all my cinematic percussion goes to this group bus here. And then from this bus, I'm sending a parallel send to an effects channel. And on this effects channel, I have a vintage compressor and a DAT tube instance. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use these two plugins in parallel, which means that we will be blending the signal, the compressed signal coming from this compressor, and also the saturation coming from that tube to the original signal of my percussion. And you will see that I'm compressing quite a lot here on vintage compressor, and I'm saturating quite a bit here with that tube. But that doesn't matter, because what we want to gain from this process is add more body to our cinematic percussion. Because we're going to tame this problem where we have these big transients and no body to the sound, and in the end, our cinematic percussion in the context of an orchestra sounds like tiny hits, like, you know, we don't want this. So I'm going to make the sound bigger, but at the same time, I'm not compressing the original bus at all. So let's have a listen, and I'm going to pull up the fader of my parallel channel. As you can hear, the sound becomes massive, okay? And the great thing is that I'm not raising the level on my master fader too much, because this is a very, very compressed signal that I'm injecting into my path. Again, these are a little bit extreme settings, but if you have a high energy track with lots of electronic elements, this is going to be the solution so that your cinematic percussion will cut through the mix and will not be completely demolished by everything else that's going on. If you have like electric guitars, synths, you're going to need something that's really aggressive and that can help your percussion cut through the mix. So as you can hear, massive, massive difference. Now, before I go on to the bus processing, I want to play everything that we've done up to this point without the envelope shapers, without the reverbs, without the parallel processing, and then with. And let's see what difference we made to our cinematic percussion mix. And again, if you're going to go very aggressive with your parallel compression, then you can, of course, blend it in when you need it, when you have these high energy sections and you want to make sure that your cinematic percussion is upfront and it doesn't get drowned in the mix. So as you can see, it's not just louder, it's bigger, it's more even, but it still has dynamics, it breathes. I haven't overcompressed anything. So now let's move on to our bus, and I'm going to show you what I'm using there. So what I'm using is, first of all, an EQ. I'm rolling off low end because I might need it for some drones or something like this. Then I'm removing some frequencies that might be problematic, and these frequencies are generally what would cross with my cellos and my double basses. I'm adding a little bit of mid-range, and this all depends, of course, you can go by ear. The next thing I'm doing is I'm adding an imager plugin, and I'm aiming to make my cinematic percussion a little bit wider so that I leave more space for other elements in the center. And then I might follow this with a clipper and, of course, a limiter. And I found that Razor works incredibly well for cinematic percussion, especially with these settings, with the auto release and the fast initial release. So depending on the material, I might use a clipper. Sometimes I will not use a clipper, depending on how aggressive I want my cinematic percussion to sound like. Let's have a listen, and I'm going to turn on each plugin one by one. Now for the fun of it, let's listen with the processing, but without the envelope shapers, without the reverbs and the parallel compression. So, as you can see, it's a sum of all the parts. It's a recipe that needs all the ingredients. So, if you just add some processing on your group channel, you will get to a better result. But when you add all those little ingredients, so the envelope shapers, the reverbs, the parallel compression, this all adds up to a bigger cinematic percussion sound. And again, I'm showing you quite a few tricks here. You don't have to use all of them. This could be useful for a really busy mix with lots of elements, but maybe if you have something that's a little bit more minimal, you don't have to do all these things that I showed you here today. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. And I think that now you're ready to go and mix your cinematic percussion. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.